Okay, I hope I'm audible to all my students who are attending this particular lecture for the CBSE Class 12th Economics course. In this particular lecture, I'm going to continue with the discussion of the 2025 CBSE sample paper for the Class 12th Economics course. And if all my students can recall that in the previous lectures, I had started the discussion of section A, which primarily contains all the questions from the macroeconomics module. Remember, the students who are preparing for the 2025 CBSE board exams, the class 12th economics course majorly has two modules. One is macroeconomics and one is Indian economy. Currently, I am focusing on section A, which contains questions from the macroeconomics module. Okay, we were solving some of the objective type questions in the previous lecture, and we had solved starting from question number one. In the previous lecture, we had solved till question number 5. Now, in this lecture, I'm going to start with the discussion of question number 6, which all students can now see on your screens. So let's start with the discussion of question 6 in this lecture. So let's read question number 6. Punjab National Bank receives a deposit of 80,000 rupees. The reserve requirement is 10%. If the bank decides to hold reserves equal to 20% of the deposits instead of the required amount, how much excess reserves does the bank? Okay, now first of all, students should be able to recognize that this is a question which comes from the money and banking unit. In the banking chapter, we have learned that commercial banks tend to hold reserves, which are some fraction of the deposits. Required reserves are exactly equal to the cash reserve ratio plus the statutory liquidity ratio, and required reserve ratio is that proportion of the deposits which commercial banks are mandated to keep either with the central bank in the form of cash or with themselves in the form of cash, gold, or government securities. When the commercial banks keep reserves with the central bank purely in the form of cash, we call it as cash reserve ratio. And when the commercial banks keep a fraction of the deposits with themselves in the form of cash, gold, or government securities, that's called the statutory liquidity ratio. Okay, this is all the theory part. Now let's come to the numeric. So if I come to the whiteboard to solve this, I'm just writing the main heading for completeness. We are looking at CBSE class 12 economics 2025 sample paper. 2025 sample paper. We are going to solve it in this particular lecture and looking at question number 6. So we are given that the deposits received by Punjab National Bank are rupees 80,000. We are also given that the required reserve ratio, I can write required reserve ratio is how much the required reserve ratio is given to us as 10%. That means how much are my required reserves? How much should the bank hold as required reserves? They should be 10% of the deposit. So 10% of 80,000 is how much? Comes out as rupees 8,000. If the required reserve ratio is 10%, it means the bank should hold rupees 8,000 as required reserves. Now, how much is the bank actually holding? So bank is actually holding 20%. So the reserve ratio which the bank is currently holding is 20%. It's given to us. If I come back to the question paper, students can read this. Bank decides to hold reserves equal to 20%. That means how much reserves the bank holding in total. So I can write total reserves are how much? 20% of the deposits. How much are the deposits? 80,000. So in totality, banks are holding total reserves as how much? Rupees 16,000. And we know that total reserves is equal to, students can write this, it is the sum of required reserves plus excess reserves. Excess reserves are the reserves held by the commercial bank over and above CRR and SLR. And holding excess reserves is not compulsory or mandatory. Remember, holding required reserves is mandatory. Okay, as per RBI guidelines. But holding excess reserves is completely optional and it varies from commercial bank to commercial. Now I need to find excess reserves. Very simple. If I erase this initial portion off, how much is my total reserves? Total reserves are 16,000. How much is my required reserves? 8,000. And I need to find excess reserves. So now what will excess reserves be? So I can write here that excess reserves will simply be 16,000 minus 8,000, which is 8,000 rupees. This is my answer for this particular MCQ. The bank is going to hold excess reserves equal to rupees 8,000. So I'm revising it again. We were given that the required reserve ratio is 10%. So 10% of 8,000, 10% of the deposits, which is 80,000, was 8,000. Then we were given that the bank is holding 20% in total. So 20% of 80,000, 16,000. When I subtract them, I get the excess reserves, which is 8,000 rupees. Okay, so I can come back and we can mark the correct answer is 8,000 rupees. It's matching with the answer provided by the Cbse. Okay, so let's look at question number 7. The interaction between the concept of price level and dynamics of aggregate demand in the economy is interconnected as follows. Which unit is it in macroeconomics? Remember, it corresponds to the aggregate demand and aggregate supply. So let's read the answers. Price level increases, aggregate demand increases. False. This is not correct because we know that price and aggregate demand share inverse relationship. When like individual demand, aggregate demand is also inversely related to price. So my answer is option B. When price level increases, aggregate demand decreases. This is my answer. Let's look at other options also. Changes in price level have no impact on aggregate demand. Wrong. When price changes, aggregate demand will change. And relationship between price and aggregate demand is unpredictable. This is also. Obviously, when the general price level in the economy will go up, when on the whole commodities are going to become expensive, aggregate demand will decrease. So my answer is option B. Like the individual demand curve in microeconomics is downward sloping, the aggregate demand curve is also downward sloping with respect to price. When price level goes up, aggregate demand decreases. This is my answer. Okay. Now moving forward to question number 8. Read the following statements carefully. And now we are also given that which statement is correct and which statement is false. So it's a statement-based question. Statement 1. Exchange rates of a currency can either be fixed or floating. True. We have done this in our lectures on balance of payments and exchange rates. Fixed exchange rates are when there is complete government intervention, when demand and supply of foreign currency is determined by full control of the government, when the government fixes the exchange rate. On the other hand, floating exchange rate occurs when the exchange rate is determined by market forces of demand and supply. There is no government intervention at all in floating exchange rate system. So it's true. Statement 2, exchange rate is also impacted by some factors that are economic, political, or psychological as well. True. Whether exchange rate is going to appreciate or depreciate depends upon economic factors. It depends upon politics, whether elections are near the corner or not. It also depends upon psychological factors like investor sentiments. Whether the investor is expecting returns from the domestic market, higher returns from domestic market, or higher returns from foreign market. So all these factors determine the exchange rate. They impact the exchange rates. All these factors, economic, political, or psychological, will have an impact on the exchange rates. Okay, so both the statements are correct. Answer is option C. Both statements 1 and 2 are true. So students can see this matching. Question number 9. Given we are given the consumption function is 750 plus 0.5y. C represents consumption expenditure, Y represents national income, and investment expenditure is 2300, what would be the consumption expenditure at the equilibrium level? Again, it's a question which students can check out my lectures on aggregate demand and aggregate supply unit in the macroeconomics course. If I come to the whiteboard now to solve this, we are looking at question number 9. I'm quickly writing what is given to us. We are given that the consumption function is 750 plus 0.5y. Just by looking at the consumption function, students can see that the autonomous consumption is 750 and marginal propensity to consume is 0.5. Okay, this is my consumption function, and we are given that the investment expenditure is 2300. Now, in equilibrium, what happens? I need to find the equilibrium value of C. To find equilibrium value of C. Now, how do I find the equilibrium value of C? First of all, I have to find the equilibrium Y. So, in equilibrium, we know that Y is equal to aggregate demand, and aggregate demand itself is equal to C plus I, assuming that there is no government expenditure and no net exports at the moment. So Y is equal to how much is C? 750 plus 0.5Y. How much is I? 2300. If I take 0.5y to the side, y minus 0.5y is equal to how much is 750 plus 2300? Let's solve that. Comes out as 3050. So y minus 0.5y is 0.5y equals 3050. So how much will y come out as? 3050 divided over 0.5, which comes out as 6100. That means my output or my income is rupees 6100. Now I can just find the consumption. Finding the consumption is easy now. Erasing all this off. My equilibrium consumption will simply be 750 plus 0.5 times. What is my equilibrium income? 6100. So I can solve this 750 plus 6100 times 0.5 comes out as 3050. And if I add 750 to it, it comes out as rupees 3800. This is my answer for this numerical. This is my equilibrium level of consumption. Equilibrium level of consumption. So I can come back to the paper and we can mark the correct answer. It's 3800. Option D. It's matching with the answer provided by the Cbse sample paper. And then the last question I intend to look at for today. Question 10. Which of the following best defines unilateral transfers in context of international transactions? Now remember from my lectures on national income, unilateral transfers are one-sided transfer payments where you have not produced any good or service. Any transfer payments which are without exchange for any good or service. And unilateral means one-sided. So funds transferred internationally as loans for a specified tenure and interest rate are not unilateral transfers. When you are making loan contracts, you have to repay them in the future. So these are not unilateral transfer payments. Trade transactions involving goods and services between two countries. This is not a unilateral transfer payment because no good or service should be produced. When you are making a transfer payment, no good or service should be produced. So it's not B. Payment made by one party without expecting anything in the future. This is the correct answer. When you are making payment without expecting any return in the future. In case of loans, you expect a return in the form of interest rates. In the second case, goods or services were getting produced, not transfer payments. In the last case, this is also not the answer because investments made by a country in the stock market of another country. When you make investments in stock markets, again, you expect returns in the future. But unilateral transfer payments are one-sided payments without expecting any return in the future. My answer is option C. Payments made by one party without expecting any return. Okay. So this is where I stop in this lecture. We have done all the MCQs from section A. Now in the next lecture, I'm going to start with the discussion of question number 11. So any doubts in this lecture, students can unmute their mic and ask, or you can get in touch with me for doubts on call or WhatsApp, or you can mail me your doubts at divineschoolof economics@gmail.com. This is where I stop in this lecture.